Hey, I'm Siobhan, community cultivator and founder of Be Free Project. The Be Free Project podcast was created for community, sisterhood, and personal growth. Each week, you'll be inspired and motivated to do the work to show up for yourself so you too can feel fulfilled and be free. Now grab a pen and a notebook and let's get into the show. The best decision that you can make today is joining the Be Free Inner Circle at BeFreeInnerCircle.com, a community for like-minded women to find their forever friends and get accountability to do their personal growth work. Your membership includes a private, exclusive community of women who are not only showing up for themselves, but for one another. Weekly live events with me and or guest speakers, daily accountability so this way you can finally get stuff done, mentorship from yours truly, and so much more. Now, there's no long-term commitment and you can cancel at any time. However, I can guarantee the moment you join, you're going to feel a warm embrace and you're going to want to stick around. Every single member of the Be Free Inner Circle will walk away with clarity, fulfillment, and confidence because guess what? When you're around me, you're going to win. So come and grow inside the Be Free Inner Circle at BeFreeInnerCircle.com. Hey, welcome back to the Be Free Project podcast. I am very excited to be in your ears once again, just to have really good conversation and insight on something that's very, very important to me, which is friendship. And so this week I am interviewing the author of the book Frientimacy. Her name is Shasta Nelson, and she's a friendship expert, a leading voice on loneliness and creating healthy relationships. Whether she's speaking at conferences or on TEDx stages, giving media interviews to outlets such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, or appearing as a guest on the Harvard Business Review podcast or the Steve Harvey Show. She is constantly teaching all of us how to create healthier and more fulfilling relationships in our lives. Her research and wisdom can also be found in her 3 books. Friendship Don't Just Happen teaches us how to make new friends as adults. Frientimacy, How to Deepen Friendships for Lifelong Health and Happiness, teaches us how to make our relationships more meaningful and healthy. And then her newest book, The Business of Friendship, Making the Most of the Relationships Where We Spend Most of Our Time, teaches us why we need to foster better relationships in our jobs. Shasta, welcome to the Be Free Project podcast.
I'm so happy to be with you, Siobhan. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. You don't know how excited I am to even have this conversation about friendship. So just tell us a little bit before we get into it, because I'm really excited. So I know I'll start asking questions, but tell me, how did you become a friendship expert? Like, what inspired you to do this type of work?
Well, I can look back on my life and I've just always been like, friends have always been a really high value. And then my first career, I'm actually a trained pastor. And so I have my master's of divinity. And I can look back now and see that in my worldview at that time, that was where I saw community happen. Like that was where people came together, where belonging mattered, where we were there for each other, where we could make a bigger difference collectively than we could individually, where personal growth happened in relationships. And so that I got a lot of my passion in that space where it was like, how do you actually create when a visitor walks in the door, what is it that actually makes them feel loved? And how do you actually bond a small group of people in an appropriate way where we're not just like vomiting all of our stuff on each other? And what are healthy expectations in relationships? Like that's where I got a lot of my opportunity for kind of asking big questions and researching. But then it really became clear to me that, that I should say it this way. I wanted to do more community building outside of all of us having to have a shared religious belief. That I feel like it was limiting to feel like you had to like agree with me on something theologically, or like that was kind of it is an important community. And I found that I just felt more and more called to kind of help create community, even when we all have different religious differences or whatever. And so the last 15 years, I've been really passionate about community in general. And what is it that makes for friendship and loneliness? And, 12 years ago, I was really looking at friendship, and I love it. Speaks so highly of you to be exploring this subject, to be doing the growth on this subject, because I'm telling you what, like a decade ago, it was like a publisher would say, oh, nobody reads books on friendship. Like that is not a subject that, we had a book come out 5 years ago and it didn't sell well. So like, we're not really interested. Or, magazines were like, oh, we did a friendship article on how to be friends like 2 years ago. So yeah, we're good for another year or two. And I was always like, And yet you talk about how to lose 5 pounds like every single month, and like there's so much more about friendship. So I love, love, love that you view this as the important topic that it is.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because as I was telling you before we started recording, I had read one book about friendship, and then because that book opened up so much in me, I'm like, oh, let me see if there's other books out there. And then I came across your book and several others. But the thing is, these types of books as it relates to friendship are not in the forefront, right? And it's like, but we crave friendship and we crave community and we crave belonging. However, there's not an emphasis in my perspective where that's in the forefront, where something, someone is teaching us like, oh, this is what it takes to build community.
Yeah, we, especially women, we are so focused and have been historically on the romantic relationship.
Yes.
Like that to us is like the one that we're willing to buy 1,000 books on, pay buku bucks to have somebody match us up and give us the workshops and all that kind of stuff. And then having the baby, same thing. It's like our body, all of a sudden, like we'll buy every book on how to be pregnant, even though our body knows how to kind of do it. I mean, it's amazing how those two relationships, we are willing to invest so much time, energy, and learning. And yet the vast majority of our relationships will be non-romantic and non-child. And so all of a sudden you're sitting here, and especially for women, those relationships haven't always historically been that great for our health and happiness. It doesn't always correlate that the more kids you have, or that if you're married or not, that does not always correlate with greater happiness and greater earning and greater, better mental health and better physical health and longevity. But our friendships really do. And that was a really source of curiosity to me years ago. It's like, why is nobody talking about this? The research shows this is like the biggest quantity of relationships in our life. It's the one that helps us feel like we belong and are seen and supported in our lives. And yet it's kind of the one that we treat like it's great if we have it. And if not, I barely have time for these other ones. So we kind of are willing to let it go, but it's having a huge cost on all of us. So yeah, again, it speaks really highly of you that you not only read one book on it, but then you actually researched and went and found another one, because that's not the norm.
And you're so right. And it's so interesting because once I read like your book and then this other book that I read, my mind started opening up. It's like, oh, I want to study this, and I want to study in a way so that not only do I continue to attract the right type of friends to me, but that I am a better friend. And so, and we're going to get into your book, because reading your book, it opened my eyes a lot on some of the things that, how you can think that you're a great friend. You're like, wait, you have some things that you need to work on. And so I'm very grateful that there is information out here that's really supporting that, because you're right. Like when you think of like, there's so much content, magazine articles, books, everything on romantic relationships and parenting. But however, we crave friendships. Like we yearn to have the right type of women in our lives to grow with, but yet, like you're saying, like there's just not a lot of conversation around it. So I know in the opening of your book,
I was going to say, it's almost like we just assume we should know about friendship. Like it's just like but most people don't think they have anything to learn about it. Right. So we just kind of assume that we're a good friend and that we know what we need to know. And that if we don't have friends, it's because we haven't found the right person. And so it's kind of like always this emphasis on needing just to find more people. And so that it always comes down to just, I just need to meet better people or something. But yeah, to your point, it's really something that most of us have never been taught. And so it makes complete sense that we would need to learn this and show up and say, what do we know about this now? So,
absolutely.
Sorry for interrupting.
No, you're totally fine. Like, I feel like we're probably going to be like ping-ponging back and forth. But yeah, there's just not a lot of conversation on it. And what, I guess I will share this before we get into the book. What really opened me up last year, I had a friendship breakup, and it broke all the pieces of my heart, and I just wasn't ready for it. And this friendship was a 25-year friendship, and it was no drama. It was nothing, like, it was just, we just couldn't come to terms on a specific issue or what have you. And it wasn't until late last year that I started thinking through, like, well, what do you need in a friend? And I made this massive list of all the things that I needed in a friend. And I text this list to my friends. And I said, not only is this what I need from you going forward, but this is how I'm going to show up. And so then I started, when I shared the list, my friends responded in a very positive way. And I'm like, oh, now that you're learning so much and you've grown and you've healed and you've grieved and all of this, how can you teach other women about this? So I started talking about this pre-reading the books. So then when the books came into my,
Beautiful.
my forefront or what have you, I'm like, oh, there's so much more that I can learn and that I can teach. And that's the exact reason why I wanted to have you on the podcast, because not only to share my perspective, but to have, your perspective, especially because you name yourself, or you call yourself a friendship expert, which I'm like, oh, that's huge. That means you know all the things. So tell me, what inspired you to write this book specifically around friendship and intimacy?
Yeah, the Frientimacy one came around because, so it's interesting. A lot of us are lonely. I'll start there. A lot of us have a stigma around the loneliness, and we actually are quick to not want to be lonely. And so we'll say, no, 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 I have friends, and we'll name people, and we'll be like, I'm busy, I have a social life, and people like me. And, we kind of like have that whole thing. But then if we actually are mature enough to name the loneliness as for what it is, and there's about 64% of us who report feeling lonely on a regular basis. So it's very prevalent. And if we're willing to admit it, that's similar. I should just define that too. For loneliness, it's a hunger for more. We have more capacity to give and receive love in our lives. And so it's not a bad thing to be lonely. It's like feeling hunger or feeling tired when it's time to sleep. It's only bad or unhealthy if we don't identify it as a need or don't have access to those things. And so it's not bad to feel lonely. The most emotionally mature, intelligent among us will be quicker at actually being like, oh, that's loneliness, as opposed to calling it boredom or calling it hunger and eating. It's actually identifying it as a desire to be more connected to people, to be more seen, to be more in relationship. But what I've found is that when people feel that loneliness, as I was kind of saying earlier, a lot of us think, oh, I need to make new friends. That's like where our brain goes. And so my first book, Friendships Don't Just Happen, was more about how to make friends as an adult. But when I was out speaking and doing workshops and retreats and everything, I started really seeing, actually most of us aren't lonely because we aren't interacting enough. Most of us are lonely because we don't have enough intimacy in the current friendships. And that's really what started. Like, it's not that we're all hermits out in the middle of nowhere and have absolutely no access to people. Most of us who are lonely are successful. We're caretaking for people. We have families. We're busy. We're talking to people all day long. We might be in customer service or having jobs where we're interacting. Like, we're not for lack of interaction. We're not lonely because we have nobody. We're lonely because the ones we have don't feel meaningful enough. And so I started really kind of identifying that most of us don't need to know more people. Most of us need to feel more known by a few people that we already have in our lives. And so Frientimacy is kind of like my way of answering that kind of loneliness.
Now, this was the first time that I believe I ever heard the word intimacy used as it relates to friendship. So when I saw the title, I'm like, Frientimacy. And I'm like, oh, this is about having more intimacy within your relationship or your friendships. But it never even occurred to me before. But as I'm reading the book, it makes so much sense. And I'm just curious, like, what made you even want to discuss that even more? Because it's not something that we typically hear, like, oh, I have to be, because when you think of intimacy, 9 times out of 10, people go right to sex, right? Into romantic relationships.
Yep, all the time.
But when you hear intimacy and friendship, it's almost like, how can those two go together? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Totally. Yeah. And in fact, for a long while, I was on a campaign to say we need more intimacy in our lives, in our friendships. And I just ran into the same battle where everyone was always like, you want us to have sex with our friends? Like, right. And I was always like, intimacy is not synonymous with romance and sex, but that's kind of the category we've given it. Like, we just so make those synonymous. Intimacy is a depth of feeling seen, of feeling connected, of feeling safe with each other. It's where we feel like the other person's there for us, where they know us, they love us. And so that's what we're craving in our relationships. And unfortunately, our culture has kind of like acted like that's a romantic thing, especially for men. I will say for men, that men in even higher numbers, the only place we've allowed them culturally and given permission and modeling and encouragement to have intimacy is with romantic relationships. And then I kind of get mad because all of us, the women, tend to get upset with them when they remarry after death and divorce faster or start dating again. And we're just like, that's too soon. And I was like, that's the only place we allow them to be vulnerable is in their romantic relationships. Of course, they're going to go find the next one, whereas at least with women, we have a little bit more cultural acceptance that we can have this vulnerability with women and get some of our needs met in those areas. But what we're craving in those relationships too is the safe depth. And I find that one of the things, like in a romantic relationship, to kind of carry that out a little bit further, in our romantic relationships, we get to intimacy because we have we're willing to kind of go through some frustrations with each other. Like we don't break up every time the other person disappoints us. That we may not like conflict, but in our romantic relationships, most of us will get to the place. I mean, if we're going to have a sustained romantic relationship, we will eventually have to have the conversation that says, you know what, when you do that, it makes me feel this way. Or, I feel like I'm carrying most of the responsibility in this area. Or like, what I need from you is this, right? And we'll have those conversations. In our friendships, I just find that we don't do that well. So I'm super curious about your texts and your friendships, because most of us have not had it modeled that we need to like come to our friends and say, I need this, or that I want us to improve this area, or like actually talk about our friendship. And that's one of the things that when we in romantic relationships that we report feeling closer to somebody because we've had the fights and we've love each other still. We've gone through hard things and survived it, right? But with our friendships, we have like these weird mythological expectations that we should just never have those questions or those needs, and so they disappoint us and we get our feelings hurt and we don't have these conversations. And so, but intimacy is on the other side of that. And so it's really important to me to be speaking of like what most of us are craving isn't just more social obligations. Absolutely. Or just more Facebook friends, or just more small talk. I mean, when we're talking about wanting to be connected to a person, we are saying, I want to feel more loved, which means I want them to see me and know me. I want them to feel understood. I want it to feel safe. And that's intimacy. So yeah, I had to coin a whole new word to like help give us a new page in our heads where people weren't thinking sex.
Yeah, but I love it because that's not something that, well, let me say this. It is definitely something that I was craving, but I didn't know that I was craving it. And so when that friendship ended, I started reflecting on how I showed up in the friendship, how she showed up in the friendship. And I'm never blaming anyone. Like everyone, we showed up like we knew how. But I value friendship so much in my life, and I always have. And it may be because I'm an only child. I love having women around me. I love having inspiring conversations. I love the connection, the vibe, the energy that only women have when they can get together. And so when that relationship ended, I started reflecting, thinking, okay, well, what do I really want going forward? Because I don't like the way that my heart felt at the end of this friendship. And when I wrote, because I had wrote everything down on paper first, and then I typed it up in a text or what have you, I was very intentional, and I sat on it for a few days, and I'm like, okay, this is everything that I need in a friend. And I had no hesitation about sending it only out to a close group of people. So it didn't go out to everyone.
Yeah.
But a very close group of friends. And I said, this is how I'm going to show up for you. And this is what I expect back. And then you have the opportunity to say if that's not okay for you, or, maybe there's something in the list you didn't like, but not one person said that. And I guess now looking back at it, that was my way of starting to create intimacy, but I didn't know at all that that's what I was doing. And now I can honestly say that every single woman in my life that I call friend, there's an intimate relationship that we have. And whether we talk every day or we talk every so many months, there's a bond there, and we're all growing together. And so I'm so glad that you have this book, and I can't wait to read your other books too, because this was like the first one that caught my eye, but definitely going to pick up the other ones. But I'm glad that there are books that we can read now, because I think that it's so important that we learn how to become better friends,
Yeah. And what you did was so beautiful, because like, again, we have a little more experience with romantic relationships. So it's interesting to kind of use that as a litmus. We know from social science that a relationship up levels or goes deeper when they're not just two people talking about each other. Like when you start dating, you're like, who are you? And you're talking about each other. And then we know that a relationship becomes something different when we start talking about the relationship, when we have the conversations that are like, so what exactly are we here? And like, what are your goals for us? And what do we want? And do you want kids? And, we start having like these bigger conversations about the relationship. And in a lot of our friendships, we never have that conversation. We like keep about how are you doing? How am I doing? And but to actually have the conversations about how's our friendship like showing up for you, and what do you need more of, and what do you need less of, and like what are the things I do that actually feel the most loving and supportive to you? And having those, like what you're doing with your friends, is something so you did it intuitively, and it's really interesting because we don't have a lot of modeling. I bet your friends didn't get those kinds of texts from very many of their other friends. I mean, it's kind of a rare thing that we are willing to show up and say, hey, let's just take a second to talk about what we each bring to the table, what we each need from each other, what our love languages are, how do we each feel the most love from each other, how we each respond to stress, and what do you need from me when you're in those moments, and where we're actually like getting to know each other as a person in a relationship, in this relationship, and knowing that the relationship you have with one friend, while it will have some commonalities and similarities to a friendship with another friend, the truth is that every friendship kind of creates its own pattern, its own dynamic, and so like they serve different purposes and have different needs. And like one friendship, if you talk to her every couple months, that is the consistency, the pattern that you have, and you would be alarmed if she called you. You'd be like, what's wrong, if she called you 3 days after the last phone call. Whereas another friendship, if you guys talk every day, you'd be like, why hasn't she called, what's wrong? Like we have an expectation. Each friendship kind of develops this pattern. But how beautiful of what you did to show up and to give permission and like modeling and open that conversation. I love it.
Yeah. And I really wanted my friends to know that I'm not asking you to do something that I'm not doing myself, right? And this was the first time that I ever defined what I needed in that way. And so I met a new group of friends. It's 3 ladies that I became friends with this year, actually in March of this year. And because of where we're at on our personal growth journey, I believe age plays a factor as well. There's so much intimacy started from the beginning. Like, this is what I need, and it's just been such a beautiful friendship dynamic that not only do we have as a group, but also, to your point, as individuals, where I know when I was a teenager and even in my 20s, me and my other group of friends, we did everything the same. Like whatever it was, everything was the sameness. But as you mature and you get older, you realize like, no, this is who I am. This is who you are. And I'm going to respect you for who you are. And so one thing that stood out in your book a lot was the the Frientimacy triangle. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I was there, but I'm like, I didn't know that there was someone else out in the world that knew that this was important in a friendship.
Yeah. So one of the really cool things is that when you take all the different social science out there and you're like, okay, Google's over here studying what makes for a healthy team. And these people are over here studying, the Gottman Institute is studying what makes a healthy marriage. And these people are over here studying, how many best friends do you have? And how do you determine if this person's a best friend or just a friend? And like all these amazing studies. And I was like, they're all using different words. And yet we're like, what are we all studying? Like, what is this thing? And so I just kind of overlaid every study I could find and like what different people were using and what they were measuring. And I found these 3 things. And so these are 3 things that we can use different words for, but we all will illustrate them differently. But basically every healthy relationship is built on these 3 things. And if we want to measure how healthy a friendship is or how close it is, it's how much they practice these 3 things. Any relationship, like you were just saying, any relationship that feels meaningful in your life, it's because you have practiced these 3 things, whether you were conscious of it or knew it or not, you have done this. And any relationship that is not feeling good right now, it's because you can actually look at it and identify which one of these 3 things is lacking, or which one is kind of broken or needs repair or needs intention. So those 3 things, I teach them on a triangle. The base of it is positivity, which is positive emotions, not to be confused with being Pollyanna or only saying positive things. It's how we leave both people feeling. And so it's all about empathy and laughter and enjoying and loving each other and showing up and acts of kindness and whatever we each do, it'll look different on each of us. But at the end of the day, nobody wants more friends that leave them feeling more guilty, more obligated, more judged, more negative stuff. If it's going to be meaningful, it has to be fulfilling to both of us and meaningful and enjoyable. And then from there, both sides of the triangle move up. On the one arm is consistency and on the other is vulnerability. And I teach that those should move kind of incrementally and at a similar speed. And that basically is consistency is our time together. It's our logging of our interactions. It's our shared experiences. It's kind of the compiling of our memories and the hours we're putting in together. It's what we do together. It's how we interact. It's basically just kind of every relationship, you and I could like hit it off and have positivity and like love it. And that's great. And that's a one-time thing. If we wanted to build a friendship, we would have to repeat it over and over and over. And we've all met plenty of people that we didn't repeat it enough to build that friendship and to have that. And that's what builds safety. That's what leaves us feeling like that person is there. That we have this pattern, that we have things we do together, and that's our spending of time together. And then the third is vulnerability. And so as we're spending time with each other, we're getting to know each other better. And as we make memories together, we're learning more about each other. And as we ask questions, we're starting to kind of get a feel of how does she respond when she's under stress? And what is her past experiences with her family of origin? And, what is it that she wants to do with her work next? And so this is where we're learning about each other, getting stories and feeling seen. And so these three things, we can use different words, but basically the health of any relationship comes down to, do you enjoy it? Does it feel safe and comfortable? And do you feel like you both know each other and that you accept each other? And those three things just keep working together. So as you're vulnerable, it needs to be followed up with positivity, because the last thing you want to do is be vulnerable and then have people kind of give you the weird eye or start telling you that's not appropriate or judging you. So it needs to feel good. And then you want to do it again, which is consistency. And then every time you get together, you get to know each other more, and then it feels good. And so you just keep doing these three things over and over and over. And eventually some of those relationships move to the top of the triangle as they increase in expressed positive emotions and consistent time and shared vulnerability, where we feel like we get to know each other. But that is those three things. You can look at any study of any marriage, of any team, of anything, and those are the three things that we are looking for to determine the health of that relationship.
When I tell you, I love that. I love it so much. And when I was reading it and then I was sharing it with my really great friend, it made me realize we started in that triangle, like the consistency where we were talking or texting like daily. We started with positive energy, just positivity from the jump.
Yeah.
And then
it has to start there.
It has to start there, right? And then the vulnerability, like sharing intimate things, and not to your point in the book where you said like sometimes people can share too quickly and then you instantly get turned off, like, oh, she just spilled too much too soon. It was never like that with the new friends that I've made. And so when I realized that, I'm like, oh, I'm moving up this triangle really well. But there are people who, and I know you talk about this in the book, where there's gaps, right? Where there's a lack of consistency or there's a lack of vulnerability. How can people pay attention, I guess, to the gaps and then increase them with their friends that they currently have now, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. So there's two different ways at this. One, we can kind of look at our friendships in general. I have a quiz on shastanelson.com that's a Frientimacy Quiz that is free for people to take. And you can answer 10 questions in each of these three areas, and it will give you a score of how you show up as a friend with consistency, how you show up as a friend with positivity, how you show up as a friend with vulnerability. And the goal there would be to identify which one might be the one that would make the biggest difference for you to focus on and improve. So maybe you know how to show up and follow up and stay in touch with your friends, and you're really affirming and joyful, but maybe you don't open up very much. And so you need to practice vulnerability, right? And so some of us, we can look at our relationships kind of collectively and identify which of these three areas would behoove me and my friendships to really focus on more. And then the other thing we can do is kind of look at our relationships specifically. So I can look at this friendship and say, okay, this friend, I have good consistency and positivity with them. In other words, we get together frequently, we see each other regularly, we always enjoy that time. But I don't really feel like we're getting to know each other, or I leave not feeling like I told her much about my life, or I leave and I feel like she never opens up. And so I need to work on vulnerability in that friendship if I want to deepen that friendship. Whereas I can look at another friendship and say, that friendship, oh, every time we talk, it's just like the best. We pick up where we left off. I just love her. We just like, and just tell each other everything. And I only talk to her every 3 or 4 months. And so that is a level of consistency. But if I want that friendship to grow, then it means, what would it look like if we talk every month and have less to catch up on, or what if we actually talk more frequently? So I could increase my consistency if I want that friendship to feel more supportive and present in my life. And so we can also look at each specific friendship and kind of identify like which one of these three things would deepen this friendship and leave it feeling more supportive and more meaningful to my life.
So is that a conversation that you would suggest that a friend make to another friend, like looking at their friendship with, having that conversation to say, hey, am I showing up for you in the way that you want me to show up? Do you need me to be more vulnerable? Like, is that a conversation that you think that needs to be had? Or is that something that as a friend, I would naturally pick up on like, oh, I notice that I'm not being as vulnerable with her. What's something that I can do to kind of share a little bit more? So then that way I get that in return.
Yeah, I think it would depend on the friendship. I'm certainly close friends, and I have a book study guide to go through this book, because my biggest dream is the idea of friends reading this book together and talking about it. And the book study guide kind of walks them through like getting to building their own friendship while reading this book. So I do love that idea. I think I would probably say in general practice, it's best to identify it ourselves and then kind of just be paying attention to it. It is okay to say to a friend, I've said to a friend, and I try to always phrase it as a really positive thing. I'm very big on kind of doing the affirming thing. So I found that I was walking away from a lot of friendships not feeling that seen. Like I did a really good job asking them a lot of questions about their life and really, and they would maybe ask me questions, but the questions were asking me about things that weren't the things that were really important to me. So they were asking me about work or social media posts that I'd done, but I left being like, I really wanted to talk about this and it never came up. And so one of the things I knew is that if I wanted my friendships to feel more supportive, I had to show up more. I had to actually share the things that I wanted to share. So I had to be driving to my friend thinking, what do I most want her to witness? What is most important for me to share? So I had to be intentional up front, thinking like, no matter where the conversation goes, I want to make sure I tell her about this phone call I had with my dad last week, for example. And so like, if I just sat there and waited for her to ask about this random conversation with my dad that she doesn't know, it's never going to come up. I have to choose to bring that up. And in that case, I could say to my friend, I've said to them before, like, I am working on, like, one of the things I'm trying to focus on now is making sure that I share more, that I'm more vulnerable in conversations. I admire how much you do that. Like if I have a friend who talks a lot, I always try to phrase it like, I really admire how you just show up and share so comfortably. That's something I want to focus on more. And I want to make sure that we both are leaving the conversation feeling really, really seen. And so will you help me? I'm going to be trying to share more. And if you'll just like help kind of like, it's my job to remember to do it, like it's not their job to ask the question, right? But if you catch me, like if you see me withholding or if you see me not like jumping in and talking, like I give you permission to like call me out on it and to kind of like invite me to talk more. And so that's a better way than saying you talk too much and there's no room for me to talk in this conversation.
Right,
it's me saying it's my job to show up and talk. And so I think it is beautiful to show our friends that we are thinking about how we can show up and how and be better, you know? And so I think it's beautiful to kind of bring that up to the table and to offer that too. So in a way that's affirming to them and just kind of helps them see that we're working on this. We're working on ourselves. We're all works in progress.
And I think that is so amazing because it shows the maturity and how much you care about your friend. And then also having that open communication. And it's been quite interesting during this pandemic to watch how, and I've seen several posts like this where people are blaming their friends for not reaching out to them as if we are all not going through this pandemic together. And I see this often where women don't take responsibility, so they're quick to blame their friends. And my question is always, well, did you reach out? Did you check in on your friend? Because she could have a million things going on in her life, but you're sitting over here thinking that it's personal and it's about you. And so I think the way that you phrase it to make sure that you're having that open communication, that is very, very, very important. I hope my listeners are paying attention because it's not just one-sided. Like this is a mutual relationship. And that means that we both have to show up. And it takes work. It takes work to build like really great friendships.
It does.
Yeah,
it does. And I think one of the things that pops into my head is there was a study done a year and a half ago out of University of Kansas. And it was tracking how long it takes for us to feel close to somebody else. And so it shows that it takes about 40 to 60 hours for us to go from, stranger to casual friend. And then 80 to 100 hours before we feel like we're friends. And then 200 hours before we're like, that person is a best friend. And I care less about the exact number of hours. I kind of think we could accelerate that in certain situations. And, and I think depends on what we're doing together and how we're all practicing and stuff like that. However, what it does illustrate is that even if you meet somebody like these people that you connected with last March, even if you like each other instantly and feel this affinity and this closeness, it still takes hours before you really know who they are and what they're like. You just don't know their story. You can like each other, but you don't know their life. You don't know their stories. You don't know them. You don't know what your pattern's going to be. You don't know what makes them laugh. Like it still just takes a long time to like build the database of knowing who each other is and who we are as a friendship. And so one of the things that's really important is I've been thinking a lot more about my friendships as like, that's a 100-hour friend or that's a 200-hour friend. In other words, if there's something where it feels like, oh, she's talking too much or she's not checking in on me or she's a da-da-da-da-da, I think to myself, if that's a 10-hour friend that I barely know, then I'm probably not I don't need to go like jump in and save this big investment. But if this is a close friend that we've invested years of our life together. We know each other. We've practiced high consistency. We've practiced big vulnerability. We've logged the hours, so to speak. Then I'm going to say, I have a responsibility to do everything I can to try to repair this investment. For me to walk away from a 200, 500, 1,000 hour friendship is crazy. It will take me 1,000 hours to go replicate this with somebody else. I would be much more better served having an awkward 2-hour conversation or 1-hour conversation or whatever it takes, a tough couple weeks. I will still be better off for having invested deeper in this friendship and having the other side of it be something where we have more intimacy, more safety. We know each other even better. We've survived this thing together. And I just think that so many of us are walking away from our investments. And that's one of the things that's leaving us lonely, is that if you just keep digging 5-foot wells everywhere, you're never going to get to like the 20-foot well that can really make your life abundant. So I think it's really important that we are willing to have some of these conversations and grow together, or else we just kind of end up having a lot of shallow relationships.
And I think that that's what's happening. I think a lot of women have these shallow relationships. And so when I get the DMs on Instagram or people email me like, well, how do you make new friends? And how did you find these great friends? I honestly believe that what you put out is what you get back. And so I pride myself on being a great friend and showing up for my friends in many different ways, whether they need a text in the morning just to check in and see how they're doing, whether you need me to, like I told you, one of my friends, we read books together via voice note, because that's what we both enjoy. Whatever that thing is, like being a friend first. Yeah. And I love how you talked about this in the book, and I'm kind of skipping ahead to my question, but in the book, towards the latter part of the book, you talked about being a best friend to yourself first. And I have been screaming that to the top of my lungs forever. Like, you have to learn how to friend yourself first. And so I would love for you to talk about the 3 areas that you have in the book as it relates to how to even do that, because I don't think a lot of women know how. I honestly don't.
Yeah. Well, it's been a long time since I wrote the book, so you might be better off. You might, your brain might be fresher what those things are. But the one thing that pops into my head with positivity is that we know from social science that we need to have 5 positive interactions for every negative interaction with somebody. And so when we talk about a relationship with ourself, it's like, what are you saying to yourself? What is that voice that you're giving to yourself? And like, I think sometimes we're so hard on ourselves and so judgmental, and we just think, if I were judging the relationship I have with myself if I were saying these things to somebody else, this would be a relationship that would die. It would wither and die. This person would not want to keep hanging out with me if I were saying the things that I'm saying to myself to them, and so it's learning how to and enjoying ourselves and figuring out what we enjoy doing. And like, it's important for us to feed our own hope and our own inspiration and feel pride and like all those things that are positive emotion. If I can't express pride of what I'm proud of in my own life, it's going to be really hard for me to celebrate what I'm proud of when you're proud of something. It's going to threaten me if I can't do it for myself. So I just look at positive emotion. I think that's a really, really big one, that if we don't know how to generate our own positive emotions, and if we think it's something that's done to us, that's a really big problem, because positive emotions always is a result of an action. So if I want to feel more hope, I can't just go around hoping I feel more hope. It's like, what leaves me feeling hopeful? And that comes down to vulnerability of I need to know for myself, what does leave me feeling more hopeful, right? And so what are is it songs? Is it music? Is it art? Is it having conversations? Like, what are the things that generate my hope? Or when I think about vulnerability, I think about just journaling. And for me, it's a big thing of like, if I can't describe to a close friend like how I feel loved and supported, like what they can do to love and support me, then that's not my friend's problem for not being able to do it for me. That's my problem for not having enough honesty with myself and really practicing vulnerability with myself to say, you know what, I actually love words of affirmation more than I love gift giving. So thank you for always remembering my birthday. And at the end of the day, if you just tell me where you're proud of me and what you love about me, that actually goes way further than any gift you could buy me, for me personally. Like, but if I can't say that to them, then they're just walking around blindly doing the best they can. And I'm getting mad and judging them for not doing the thing that I actually need. So I don't know, feel free to add into there anything that jumped out at you, but I just think it's so important that we have this self-awareness and that we know to do these things for ourselves, because it supports our ability to do that for others. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And so in the book, you talked about like knowing who you are, knowing your values, and then knowing your feelings. And when I read that, I'm like, yeah, those are all key things that if I'm going to be a best friend to myself first, I definitely have to know who I am. Because to your point, I cannot expect you to love me as a friend and then I don't know how to love myself. Like I don't, or if I don't know the things that I enjoy or the things that make me happy, then how can I expect you to show up for me that way? The same thing as it relates to the things that I value, and that's what's important to me. And then feelings, and feelings are huge. I think I probably started understanding my feelings last year, and it's been a process because I didn't grow up being able to express my feelings. And so when I started feeling my feelings, it was hard. It was very hard. So when you talked about it in the book, even when you talked about anger, women are, and what I have been taught, it's not okay to be angry. You can, and if you are, you definitely better not express it. And so I had this aha moment this past summer where I was angry about something, and I was FaceTiming with a really great friend, and she said, "Are you angry?" And I'm like, "No, why would you say that? Of course I'm not angry." And she said, "It's okay to be angry." And I said, "But I'm not angry." Sure enough, I go on walks every single day, and I went on a walk and I felt it. I'm like, "You are angry, and these are all the reasons why." But had she not asked me that, I would have never admitted to that. And so let's talk about like even feeling your feelings. Like, why do women struggle with feeling their feelings? And then how can they, once they learn how to feel their feelings, how can they express that with the people that they care about?
Yeah, emotional intelligence. It's such a great thing because we often think of emotional intelligence as like, we would never say this, but I think we often have taken on that as like, that we are just happy all the time and that we don't feel all these other range of feelings. And that's not the case at all. Emotional intelligence is the ability to quickly identify what we're feeling and be able to get the information we need from that and move back to a place of peace. And so anger is the appropriate response to when boundaries have been violated, when and when somebody is like not being treated fairly and justly, and anger is the appropriate response. And women are more inclined to say like, well, that makes me sad. No, that doesn't make you sad. Sad is the appropriate response to when there's been a loss. And so if your boundaries have been violated, or if things are going on in the world that are unfair, unjust, that is not something that should just make us sad. That should be that the healthy response is anger and say, this is not okay. This is not okay at all. And it's anger that gives us the motivation. Like once we can identify it as anger, we actually then have better information of what to do with it. Because if we misdiagnose that as sadness, then we're going to, well, I need to cry. Well, I need to go to my therapist. Well, I need to be on antidepressants. Or well, I need to, and so we go down this whole other road. If we identify it appropriately as anger that says something of boundary has been violated, then we go down a whole different path. What's being violated? What can I do to better protect that boundary? Who do I need to speak up to? Who do I need to speak up for? What do I need to be saying? Right. And so it's an entirely different course of action that we would take. And I think, and with our friendships, it's the same thing. I think if I can, my friends and I, we love getting into all these feelings things. And this summer on one of our Zoom gatherings, a group of us get together every single week. I put up a list of all of the feelings, and I bring these to every retreat I do. I'm really big on picking the feelings I want to feel for the upcoming year. And I'm just really big on feelings. And one of the things I did with I just listed I put the jig chart of all the feelings up, and our sharing that day was like, pick a word and then tell us a story of recently of when you felt that word, that feeling. And so it was so beautiful to like go into our sharing from that point where somebody was like, I felt lethargic. And it was like, suddenly she's telling a story about when she felt lethargic, and somebody else felt disillusioned, and somebody else felt, pride, and somebody else felt, and you're just kind of rage. And you're like having this whole beautiful conversation where we're kind of practicing naming our feelings with each other and telling stories and letting other things come up in the conversation. And it was so beautiful. And I just think that with our friends, I'm not speak exactly what you were saying earlier. Like I have to be able to identify what I'm feeling. And then you want to be in a friendship where you can actually share that, and where it's a safe thing to share, and where your friend can say it's okay to feel angry, and because you share it with another friend who's not emotionally intelligent, and they're going to be trying to talk you off the ledge and trying to kind of just calm you down. I don't need to be calmed down. The world is on fire. Like we don't need more calm people. We need people who are out protesting. Like this is the appropriate response. And so, I think to be able to know that for yourself, to have a friend who can mirror that and validate it is probably one of the most magical things in the world, because you have your own knowing and you have another friend who can witness that. And it's like, suddenly you're like, okay, I don't need the rest of the world to be on board. I have enough in me to like go do this and stand in this space. And I have that clarity. And it's a huge gift.
Oh my gosh, it is definitely a huge gift. And now that I'm feeling my feelings, I am feeling all of my feelings. And one of the things that I realized too is that you can have multiple feelings at the same time. So I can be angry and I can be excited about all the amazing things that's happening with Be Free Project. And that doesn't mean that there's something wrong. And it's something that I'm teaching my community within the
Totally.
Be Free Inner Circle as well. Like every, I think Wednesday, I do a post like, how are you feeling today? Or what are your top 3 feelings? Because
Good.
I want us as women to get comfortable with expressing ourselves. And there's some women that'll say, I'm
Yeah.
feeling sad, I'm feeling frustrated, but I'm also happy. And I'm like, yep, all of those feelings that you have are valid. And I think it's so
Yeah.
important as a friend and as a community cultivator that I allow women to have space to feel all their feelings, because oftentimes we're not allowed to. So when you talked about being angry in the book, I'm like, yes, I have a right to, yes, I have a right to be angry, and that's okay.
Yep.
And I think
Yep.
we have to continue to give women permission to do the same, because it's not something that's talked about often as it relates to like
Yep.
emotional intelligence.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. It's really important. I just did a social media post talking about like, yeah, kind of referencing like we're in a season where there's a lot of loss and a lot of grief and a lot of
Mhm.
angst. And the misunderstanding of positivity is that we just need to cheer our friends up or we just need to encourage them. Positivity does not mean going and just giving platitudes or talking somebody off the ledge or just pretending
Mhm.
like just trying to pat them on the back. Real
Mhm.
positivity is like, yeah, you have a right to feel angry. That makes complete sense. It's
Mhm.
validating the feeling. Like, yes,
Yes.
I have felt that kind of anger before. Like, you don't even have to say I would feel the same way in that situation.
Mhm.
You can just
Mhm.
say, she's feeling angry. I know what that feels like to have my boundaries violated. I might not respond even in the same way she is, but I know that feeling. And so it's being able to say, I know the feeling of being angry. Like that sucks. Or like, what are you
Mhm.
gonna do about it? And so we really need to do a better job of validating each other's feelings and
Yes.
sitting with those feelings with each other, because it's all too easy when we get on, if we're not comfortable with feelings, then we're
Mhm.
not comfortable with somebody else's feelings. And so then when they're crying, we get uncomfortable. When they're angry, we're like trying to talk to them, like think that's bad. So we really need to get comfortable with our feelings in order to really help hold the space for somebody else's feelings,
Mhm.
and to say there's a lot, like when we're all walking around just being like happy holidays and just like all
Mhm.
this stuff,
Mhm.
it's not
Mhm.
that for everybody.
No,
And
it's
they don't
not.
doesn't need to be that for everybody. And
Mhm.
so we need to do a much better job of holding the range. Like, yeah, we can have happy moments, and there's a lot of loss and there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of panic, and those are all relevant feelings too. So I love that you're doing that with your community. The more we can
Yeah.
practice on each other, I mean, that's kind of one of my big messages is the more, if I can't practice this with my friends, then what chance do I have of showing up in this world as an emotionally intelligent person who can name my feelings and give the world permission to do that? Like, it's my friendships where is a safe place for me to practice. Those are the
Yes.
places where we can try on feelings and tell those stories.
Mhm.
And if I can't do that there, then what chance do I have of showing up with strangers and showing up in the bigger world and
So
showing up in
true.
front of my boss or showing up in front of my family that's difficult or something? Like, my friends are the safe place to practice this.
Yeah, I agree 110%. And one of the things that we've been talking a lot about within the Be Free Inner Circle, which is my membership community, is giving women permission to take up space. And that
Yeah,
is
good.
something, when I tell you it's the hardest thing right now, because we are taught to be quiet. We're taught to stay in our place and be quiet and meek, or this good girl persona. But taking up space and expressing our feelings is almost like it's a new thing that has to be learned. And it's quite
Hmm.
interesting. But beautiful in the same way, because I'm learning so much, so I get to teach, my community these things.
Yeah,
But I want to
yeah,
see more of us taking up space and expressing our feelings
totally.
and not being embarrassed if you're being vulnerable. So I guess my question, how,
Yeah.
if that's something that is lacking in a friendship or a relationship, like how can women have more intimacy and vulnerability in their friendships?
So one of the places where I've noticed that we struggle the most to take up space is in
Mhm.
our successes and in the things that
Mhm.
we're proud of.
Yes.
I've noticed in a lot of relationships that we like. I used to do friendship accelerators where match people up in groups and do all this bonding stuff.
Mhm.
And I noticed that if you ask them to go around and share something they're really proud of or really celebrating in their lives and something that they're struggling with, women by and large have an easier job like sharing something they're struggling with. Like, we know how to bond over struggle, like if one person's sharing about their marriage feeling tough, like we're all like, and we can like go there quickly. It's hard to like show up and be like, like proud and excited for my kids and for my husband and for my job and for these successes. So one of the areas that it's really important to me that I love doing with my friends when I get together with them is like, so tell me something that you're really proud of in your life right now. I love that word proud. I think it's really important to kind of like be giving permission, like, and don't just tell me because your kid got an A or something. Like, we can celebrate that. What are you proud of that you've done? How did you, unless you feel like you were directly helped get that A, like, what are you proud of? Like, really, I want to just shine for a minute. You have permission. I want to hear your best, and so it's us giving permission to each other to express that pride, because we all have jobs and we want to feel proud. We all have families, like we want to feel proud, and yet we don't even feel comfortable. We feel like we have to act like we're not proud, and we have this like false humility game going on. And I think it's really important that with our friendships, at least, we practice saying, I don't want to just hear your stressors. I also want to celebrate with you. I don't want to only hear about what's not going well. I want to hear about that. And I want to hear about how you're kicking butt at such and such, and both can be true. Back to your point, like, we can be loving one thing, and often I notice it's with my friends, it's the same area. It's like the hard thing is also the thing they're really proud of how they showed up in that or something. And so to really honor, I guess for me, one of the areas where we can practice taking up more space is not just in our commiserating and in our complaining and in our like struggle, but it's learning how to show up in each other's joys and successes and cheering for each other. And being a friend, we always talk about being a friend whose shoulder we can cry on. We have a lot more, I have a lot harder time showing up in each other's like joys. If I want to have a kid and they're having kids, it's harder for me to show up. It's harder for me to show up at their wedding excited or dating when I don't have that, or when they're making tons of money and I don't have that. Like, it's harder for us to show up and really celebrate our friends and their successes. And I just think it's really important that we're modeling both directions. Like, let's be there for the highs and the lows, and not just be the friends who can cry on each other's shoulders, but be the friends who will be the biggest champions and cheerleaders for each other too. And so I think that's one small way we can like help our friends take up more space, is giving them permission to shine in our presence.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So one of the questions I get asked often, and you probably have come across this too, like, how do you make friends as adults? And the reason I'm saying that, especially now that we're in this pandemic, so it's not as easy to go to a coffee shop or to go to a concert or something, wherever people meet people. But now, because we're all at home sitting behind our computers, it's even more of a struggle. And going back to your point about loneliness, I feel like, I'm sure, and I haven't done any research on this yet, but I'm sure the numbers have increased as it relates to people feeling lonely and by themselves. And so what would be your recommendation or your suggestion on how women can make friends as adults, even while we're in this pandemic?
Yeah. And the research during COVID has been really mixed. It's been really interesting. Some people are feeling closer and more supported than ever. And in part because they're probably letting go of a lot of the social life and the busyness, and are actually, now that we're forced to do it in conversation, our relationships are going deeper. We're like doing fewer activities, but having more conversations, which is really beautiful. Because so some of us are feeling closer to friends, but to your point, there's a ton of loneliness. And one of the things that I think is really important right now during this time is, if at all possible, go back to what I was saying at the beginning, which is, most of us know enough people. We want to feel known by a few in deeper ways. And so most of us nowadays, the proximity doesn't matter as much. If I'm going to have to Zoom with somebody in my own city, I may as well Zoom with somebody who's across the country from me, who was my college friend back then. Like, we actually have, the proximity is not as important. We can now have these digital relationships in many ways that can feel as meaningful and as supportive. And so really, I invite you to think of people that you already know, who you've had positivity with, where you found yourself having fun, where you enjoy being in their presence, where you've had a good time interacting with them. Maybe people you've had consistency with over the years, but you've lost touch a little bit, but you've put in the 150 hours, and maybe it's just picking that back up and continuing to build will get you to meaningful faster than starting over with a complete stranger. And so I'm inviting you to think of the people that you would just make a list, a little post-it note. Like, I'm just grab a post-it note. It doesn't have to be extensively overwhelming, and just be like, who are 3 to 5 names of people that pop into my head, of people I wish I were closer to, or if I could be closer to, would make me happy. And then just start thinking, like, what would it take to be closer to that person? How could I reach out to them? How could I interact a little bit more? Maybe maybe instead of waiting 2 months before we call again, I reach out and we schedule the next one now, and so I really invite you to think, especially now, because if you're lonely and you go start all over, even if I could tell you how to meet somebody and get on a Zoom, it still is not going to be the fulfilling part. It's like you're going to have a more fulfilling conversation if you can pick up with somebody who you've already have some history with and go deeper, because deep doesn't happen right away. I equate like building friendships like going to the gym. Like you can go once a week or once this month and it's not going to have life-changing results. But if you go regularly, that's where the magic happens, right? And so similar to a friendship, the more, if you can kind of like find the ones where you can pick up the thread, it's going to get to meaningful faster than if you're like starting cold, if at all possible.
I love that. I love that because it puts the ball back into like your court, if you will. And so that you have to do your work and to write down several friends that you need to reconnect with versus trying to find new friends. One of the things that I've noticed that comes up a lot too online, and you talked about this in your book, Frientimacy, is like how women will start to call other women toxic. Like, this is a toxic relationship. This is a toxic friendship. And my question for you, do you think that word is being overused? And I'm sure you're probably gonna say yes. And then how can people look at themselves and say, how can I add value to this friendship? Or how did I show up in this friendship? And how could I have done better? Versus so quick to call a relationship toxic because it didn't work out in their favor.
Yeah, I love that. In my most recent book, The Business of Friendship, I'm very proud of how
Yes.
I outline toxic friendship in that chapter, because that's one of the things that comes up in workplace relationships a lot. And so kind of drawing from that, I'll just say real quick, when surveys are done, 86% of us say that we have been best friends with a toxic person. So I just kind of laugh when I hear something like that, because that means we're either all 86% of us healthy ones are friends with the same 14% of toxic people, or chances are high that somebody else thinks we're the toxic one, right? And so it's with a little bit of humility that what I think is really powerful when we know that a friendship is these three things: positivity, consistency, and vulnerability. What it says to me about a toxic relationship is that it's very rarely the person who's toxic, and it's more likely that our relationship, our pattern, has created a toxic habit or pattern. And so it's really important to identify, because I went through a friendship breakup 2 years ago and did it's like my most popular video YouTube series. So it's obviously a big issue out there, and it's heartbreaking. I'm with you. It just kills you. And yeah, I did that series. And one of the things is I was tempted to say, wow, she's toxic. Like, there was behaviors that did not impress me. And yet on the other hand, she has other friendships that didn't break up and combust. And so who am I to say she's toxic when she's holding down other relationships? So clearly I have to own that our relationship created a pattern that wasn't healthy. And once I'm able to then pull it away from that person and look at the pattern, now I suddenly am like, how did I contribute to that pattern, right? So I can sit there and say, she talks too much. She's always late. She never calls me when she doesn't follow up. I'm always the one who reaches out. Like, we can have all this languaging around how they're to blame. But if we would stop and pause and say, this is the pattern, and obviously other people have maintained friendships with this person, so it's not to say that this just automatically toxic would imply that it just destroys everything. Then what can I do differently to say, okay, how might I shift this pattern, right? So how can I show up to talk more? How can I show up to identify what means more, how we could fix this, how we could repair this, how we could increase our consistency? Like, what does it look like? And suddenly when you are able to take the word toxic away from the person and look at it instead as a unhealthy pattern, then it's suddenly a whole slew of opportunities that open up to you. And then it becomes exciting, because now you can actually do something to repair this relationship or to try to fix it. Whereas just labeling somebody, there's nothing left. There's no options. Like, you're just labeled somebody and you're just going to devalue them and like kind of walk away and think self-righteously that you're so healthy and they're toxic, when really you missed an opportunity for some serious growth.
I love all of that. I love it. I love it. I love it. And that's one thing that I refuse to do as it relates to the friendship that's no longer. I refuse to speak any ill on her name. Like, I send her love and light. I love her. Like, we had a beautiful friendship. It's just that we got to a point where I honestly feel that we're growing in two different directions, and that's totally fine. When I looked at it from the outside, I said, I had to look at myself, to your point, and I said, Siobhan, you were codependent. you had some issues and some wounds that needed to be healed. And so that is how you showed up in the friendship. That's not her issue. That is your issue. So now I have to go back and do my inner work to heal and grow. And then to make sure that I don't take those codependency patterns, if you will, to another friendship. So I really had to do my work. And now I'm like, oh, this is how you showed up. This is how she showed up. And to your point, she has other friendships that are great. But as we grown, I just think we have to pay attention to how we show up in friendships and not be so quick, to your point, to call people toxic and to blame them, because you had a part in it as well. And also to be mindful to not take those same patterns into another friendship, because I noticed I was doing some of that. Well, I wouldn't say codependency, but there were some patterns or behaviors that I had that were showing up in another friendship, and I caught it immediately. And I'm like, oh, we're not doing that here. We need to kind of fix that.
Good for you.
But it's because I've been doing my work though, you know?
Yeah, good for you. I think that's so key. A lot of our loneliness, if you're going to walk away every time somebody disappoints you, you're just going to be lonely. And you have to figure out how to, if you have my Frientimacy book right in front of you, in the opening, there's a quote like at the very beginning that I just love, that it'd be better for you to quote it than for me to paraphrase it.
It seems impossible to love people who hurt and disappoint us, yet there are no other kinds of people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so easy just to label somebody who disappoints us as toxic. And yet, if you're going to get in the habit of that, you're never going to be in meaningful, deep relationships, because it's impossible to be in a relationship with somebody who's not going to disappoint you at some point. So we have to learn to not label them and instead look at what that is. And I'm so proud of you for
thank you.
Showing up, for growing, for evaluating, for looking at this stuff, for sharing it with everybody. It's really such a blessing to all of us that you are doing this. I mean, it'd be much easier. People think it's easier to just kind of just keep moving on to the next one and not stop and reflect and grow. But it's actually a really hard way to live life. I actually think it's it might feel harder to kind of settle in and look at this stuff, but I actually think it ends up making your life feel easier and more joyful than to ignore it and avoid. So good for you.
I agree 100%. Like, now that I know what I want and need in friendships, it's easier to attract those types of relationships and be open to more people coming into my life and not feeling like, oh, I have enough friends, but like, no, I'm here for plenty. But I have to make sure that their energy is in alignment and that they're going to add value to my life. One thing I do want to talk about quickly, because you don't hear a lot of conversation about friendship breakups and how to, I guess, heal from a friendship breakup and how to move forward. So I don't know if you would like to share your experience or even some tips if somebody is going through something like that.
Yeah, it's friendship breakups are so hard. I know that I break it down in a whole video series, kind of probably in a little more articulate detail, but I think it's, and you've certainly illustrated some really beautiful things. I think it's just the most important thing for me usually is I always start with can I repair this? And my answer is always let me try. Even if I'm angry, even if I'm I think my thing is, let me try to repair it, because either it doesn't work, but I've lost nothing because I was going to walk away anyway, except now I've actually strengthened a muscle that's trying to have courageous conversations. And I'm only better served in future relationships for having tried that. Or this friendship and I have this conversation and we end up developing something deeper where we now have this shared understanding of how we hurt each other and how we don't want to do that anymore. And so it's a win-win. I've convinced myself in my head that when there's a tough moment, it's always a win-win opportunity. I will either build more skills for how to lean into tough moments in relationships, or I will deepen this friendship. And either way, if it doesn't work out, it doesn't always work out. In my friendship breakup, I tried and I couldn't fix it. And at that point, I think there's a lot of surrender and acceptance and forgiveness that has to be done. And for me, I'm very similar to you. It was I am going to do everything I can to hold gratitude for what we had, and not dismiss all of that as but say, I'm so grateful. And it was a hard exercise to do, because I think we want to devalue it, because if we hold it as valuable, then we somehow think it's going to hurt more. But I'm not afraid of hurt. I would rather say, I loved how she did this, and I love this memory, and I love that she gave this to me, and I love, and being able to kind of cultivate the gratitude for those years that we had together, and to hold hope that I did some of that for her. But right now, the only thing I can do is just hold so much gratitude. And then it's forgiving myself for where I failed, and forgiving her for how she didn't show up the way I hoped she would and wanted to. But all of that leads us to being better people, which I think is so important.
I love it. I love it. Those are really, really, really great tips. So is there any thing that we haven't talked about as it relates to friendship that you feel like women need to hear as it relates to having intimacy in their friendship?
The studies of relationships show that we replace half our close friends every 7 years. And so I think it's just really important to presence that not every friendship needs to make it forever to be valuable and helpful and meaningful. And that's okay. There's sometimes like that friend for this job or for this spiritual growth moment or for this because our kids are at this age and having this experience. And like that's meaningful and valuable. And so we don't need to only have best friends be the only ones that are valuable and meaningful or even forever friends. Like friends are valuable in so many different situations. So I think it's really valuable to just kind of remind ourselves that not everybody has to last forever to be meaningful, to be celebrated, to be appreciated. And to recognize that if we want some friends to last beyond this job, last beyond this shared neighborhood, last beyond this shared container that we have, then we have to be really intentional about continuing to keep those friendships going, because it's also very easy to have friendships end when we no longer work together, when we no longer live next to each other, when we no longer have this career in common, when our kids don't go to the same school, when we don't go to the same church. So I think it's really important also that we recognize that consistency, it's why friendship felt automatic when we were kids, is that our consistency was automatic at school. And some of us have that now, like we're consistent at a book club or at church or at work or through our kids. But if we want that friendship to last beyond that shared consistency, we have to practice finding other ways of interacting with them so that when we no longer work together, we still have a ways of interacting. When our kids no longer are close, we still like have this other friendship. So I think it's just being mindful of both. It's like learning to hold loosely with one hand, letting some friendships end and not needing to hold every single thing to having to make it. And on the flip side, saying, I don't always have to just hold it so loose that like whatever happens, and just let relationships drift apart. If they're important to me, what can I do to like maintain them so that some of them go past that 7-year cycle a little bit? So yeah, I think I just wanted to kind of presence. It's okay that not every friendship makes it. And if you're lonely and want more depth, it's like we need to learn how to go through some big transitions so that we have some friendships that are like more lifelong relationships. Those never just happen though. We have to always find a new way of being friends now that one of us has kids. And now we have to find a new way of being friends now that we don't live in the same state. And now we have to find new ways of being friends because we don't work together anymore. So the ones that make it are the ones who find a new way of being together and let their friendships keep being kind of recreated, if you will.
I love that. And I think the big takeaway from our conversation is, number one, friendship takes work. Right? It's not a one-sided thing, that is definitely mutual, and that intimacy is necessary to have a healthy friendship with other people, specifically with women, because, that's what we're talking about. But it's very, very important. And you have to do your part. And when you do your part, being your own best friend first and putting in the work, then naturally you're going to attract people that are similar to you, that you have things in common with, that you can, develop and grow a beautiful friendship. So I love that. If you can tell us where we can learn more about your books that you have, as well as where we can connect with you on social.
Yeah, shastanelson.com. You can find links to all of my books there, and they're all on Amazon and all the major bookstores and stuff like that. So you could also Google my name on any of those sites. And social media, I love playing on Instagram and on YouTube and on Facebook and on LinkedIn. So if you're on any of those, Twitter a little bit, but on any of those, Shasta M. Nelson is where you can find me on most all of those sites. And I love connecting with you. So come find me and tell me that you came from Siobhan's community, and I will know you are a good person.
Yes. And I'll make sure that I link to your books and all your social media channels and everything in the show notes. I just want to say thank you. Thank you for having this much needed conversation. And I know that the listeners are going to find so much value in it. And then hopefully they start to build more intimacy in their friendship. So thank you so much for being a part of this interview today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, my privilege. Thank you for the good work, and so many blessings on you and your community and all your listeners. Thank you for just helping to inspire and bring people together. It's so needed.
My name is Crystal Sledge. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. I joined the Be Free Inner Circle about a year ago. There's so many things that I love about this community. The motivational videos, the daily motivational posts, articles, podcasts, the weekly, monthly, and daily accountability check-ins. But most importantly, I love that I am surrounded by like-minded women. I feel comfortable to say what's going on with me in my highest moments, in my lowest moments, and I'm not afraid of being judged. I know I have women that are going to rally around me and uplift me and motivate me and empower me.